think of a really good illustration to open with, and really the best thing I could come up with, and I think it's good. It fits what I'm looking at, but not earlier this week. I think it might have been Sunday evening or something like that. I was watching The Kingdom of Heaven, and I don't know how many of you guys have seen that movie, but if you haven't seen it, the picture that it gives us is back at the 12th century. King Richard and Salahuddin, who was the leader of the Muslim forces. It's a period of time that's known as the Crusades, and the Crusades were it's kind of an interesting period of time, because the whole premise of the movie was that they're protecting these holy sites, and what you had was Christian forces against Muslim forces, and as I've already said, the Christian forces are led by King Richard the Lionhearted, and then the Muslim forces are led by Salahuddin, who basically was a Kurdish Muslim, and he managed to bring the Muslim people together. Up until that time, they fought each other, and so now they organized to fight against the Christians. Now the knights at that time were divided between knights of the English table and then the Templar Knights. And so they were based in the Holy Land to protect pilgrims. Now the pilgrims were both Christian travelers as well as Muslim travelers, because you got to go back and look that Jerusalem, Mecca, all of these holy cities meant something, seemed like, to everyone. And so there were these constant battles over those cities and those lands, because whoever controlled the land controlled the belief. And so the situation in the movie, The Kingdom of Heaven, is the protection of the city of Jerusalem. To protect the city, to protect the pilgrims who are traveling the highways to the city of Jerusalem. And again, keeping in mind this is in the 12th century, 1100s. And this young blacksmith named Balian is raised up by his father, who is a great knight. And this knight basically passes on to him the responsibility of protecting Jerusalem and protecting all of the visitors who are coming in. Now, one of the things that really comes out in the movie is the sheer brutality on both sides, Christian and Muslim. You know, I think about that even today with some of the things that we're facing. And I made this comment. It was after I watched this movie that I made this comment, that right now there's a strong push to de-arm, or for the disarming of the American people. And so, you know, just facing some of those things in the future. But I got to tell you, I step back and I have to ask this question as the minister of CrossRoads Christian Church. And it's a fine line, and it's probably going to tick a couple of people off. But when it comes down to it, I want to be known as a Christian American and not an American Christian. And I hope that you know what I mean by that, because where it goes in the story is Balian, this courageous young man, leads the forces in defending Jerusalem against this attack from the Muslim world, but he finally comes to a point of understanding that for the survival of innocent men and women and children inside the city of Jerusalem, that even in all of his courage, the best thing that he can do is to let the city go. And so he surrenders the city. He surrenders the city to Salahuddin. And Salahuddin makes this fascinating comment to him. He says, if you will surrender the city, then I will allow safe passage for every person who is in Jerusalem to the sea, to the Mediterranean Sea, and to Christian world after that. And so he accepts, and then he asks him this question, what's Jerusalem worth? And Salahuddin says, nothing. And then he pauses and he says, and everything. So Balian goes back to his post in the city and he reports to the people that he surrendered Jerusalem. And then he makes this statement. This is the second point that I kind of got out of the movie. Not only the brutality that religion has brought to the world, and I say religion, I'm not talking about Christianity, even though sometimes, let me address that for just a second. Sometimes Christianity is misused for the same purposes of any other world religion. And it brings heartache and carnage and destruction. And that's not what Jesus ever intended. And in that period of time, the Crusades, that's what it looked like. We'll take the world by force. Jesus never, ever intended that. And so it leads to this young man making the statement, if this is the kingdom of heaven, let God do with it as he will. If this is the kingdom of heaven, then let God do with it as he will. And it was because he saw all of the carnage and all of the hurt that was brought about by these battles. And what it led me to understand is that there are times when courage places individuals in situations where they cannot succeed. Now let me say that in a different way. Courage does not always equal success, at least here on this earth. It doesn't always equal success. And so what does that have to do with tonight? Well, tonight we're going to look at a couple of passages that we read last week, and I want to go back and revisit it. The first is chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. It reads, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple who was known to the high priest came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You are not one of his disciples, are you? The girl at the door asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. And then over to verses 25 through 27. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, you are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? And again Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Now, when the other disciples deserted Jesus, which was a prediction that Jesus had made, that you're all going to desert me tonight. When they deserted Jesus after he was arrested, Peter basically refuses to do so. And so he follows Jesus at a distance, and we're told that there's another disciple with him who follows at a distance as well. Now, the interesting thing about this disciple we learn in the text is that he is known by the high priest. Now, let me just go ahead and ask you, who do you think this other disciple is? What? I heard it. John. Who said John? Okay. Paul said John. You said John. Any other thoughts of who it might be? Okay, there is that thought. I didn't think anybody would get that. He said Judas. Let me tell you that through the years there's been a lot of discussion about who this disciple is. Some people say that it's a disciple who we will never know his identity. And that's probably the easy way out. He's not named, so let's leave him unnamed. Other people think that it was Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea, because both of those guys were members of the Sanhedrin, so they would be perfectly welcome at the house of the high priest. They would be recognized. They would be known by him. And you guys know that Joseph of Arimathea, or you should know that, Joseph of Arimathea, who gives Jesus his tomb, was a disciple, but he was also a member of the Sanhedrin. Nicodemus had come to Jesus in John chapter 3 by night to find out more about him, and we believe that Nicodemus put his faith in Jesus as well. Still, other people believe, as Bruce said, that this was Judas, because Judas obviously is one of the disciples. If he's been scheming the whole plan to give Jesus over into their hands, then he would be free to come and go. Now, here's why I don't think it's Judas, okay, is because, number one, by this time I believe Judas's eyes have been opened to what he's doing. Secondly, Peter certainly wouldn't be hanging around with him. In fact, if Judas was with Peter, he probably wouldn't be alive very long. Okay? But again, I mean, those are the thoughts. Now, traditionally, the view has been that it's John. Okay? But in all honesty, when I read this text, I had to come to terms with, how is John that well known by the high priest? I mean, that's a fair question, right? I mean, here's John, who is the beloved disciple. By the way, part of the reason I think it's John is because John was always in the habit of not naming himself. I mean, you never see him name himself in this book. In his gospel, you never see him name himself. And so I believe personally that it's John. And so then the question comes up, how was John so well known among the members, the staff of Caiaphas' household? And there's a couple of theories. I mean, when I started digging on this, there's a couple of theories that come up. One is, and this was by a guy by the name of Polycrates or Polycrates, I don't know how you pronounce his last name, but he was a historian in the second century, and he wrote a lot about the Apostle John, and especially on the fourth gospel. And one of the things he notes is that John really never does name himself, that everyone traditionally believes that the disciple that Jesus loved is a reference to John the apostle. So part of what Polycrates writes is the fact that John was known, according to him, that John was known to wear, and I have to look to see what this name is, the patalos, I guess would be the way that you pronounce it. And the patalos was this narrow gold band that members of the priestly line would wear around their foreheads. And upon that gold band was inscribed, unto the Most High God. Or actually what was written on it was holiness unto the Lord. So he said that John would often wear that, and if that's the case, then that means that John was actually a member of Caiaphas' family, okay? That he was a part of the royal priesthood or the priestly line. Now, that's the only one that really writes about that is a guy by the name of Polycrates. I think the explanation is a little bit more simple than that, but that's one explanation that's given, that this might have been John, that he was a part of the high priest family and he could come and go as he pleased. So the second option or the second explanation, and it makes the most sense to me, is that John's father, which is Zebedee, he has two sons, James and John. And according to Mark chapter 1, verse 20, Zebedee is a pretty successful fisherman. And the reason that we know that is because it says that when Jesus called James and John, that they left Zebedee, their father, on the boat with the rest of the hired hands. Okay? And so here's a fisherman who basically had employees. I mean, he had several employees. And so he was viewed as being a fairly successful fisherman in the fishing business. And one of the great industries in the region of Galilee was the production of bringing in the fish. Now, if you know anything about Galilee and the cities that were there were several little cities. But really, in order to employ hired hands, it probably indicates that they were also a part of what is called the salt fish trade. I mean, it's one thing to sell fresh fish along the seashore. That was bad. But it's one thing to sell. But in that day and age, fish don't take long to spoil. And so fresh fish are sold along the Sea of Galilee, but the salted fish were meant for areas that were further off, places like Nazareth, places like Jerusalem, Jericho. Jerusalem is nearly 50 miles away, 55, something like that, away from the Sea of Galilee. And so to get fresh fish there, you wouldn't have been able to do that. And so many, many people believe that John's family supplied Caiaphas' household with these salt fish. Now, some people will say, well, isn't this kind of a stretch? But when you start looking at some of the history and the traditions that were passed down, by the way, in the Jewish families, tradition was important to them. I mean, the stories. You guys, my grandfather was a great storyteller. I used to love to listen to some of his stories. I used to get tired of some of his stories, but I used to love to listen to some of the stories. And honestly, probably some of you who are a little older kind of remember that there used to be a time when you passed on facts of the family and other things by stories that you told. And that's huge within, Judaism. And so the folklore was very important to them. And so don't just dismiss that. When we sometimes hear legend and tradition and folklore, we kind of chuck it out. But that was important to Jewish families. That's the way they passed on information. And according to H.V. Morton, who was a British journalist, in fact, probably the most memorable thing that he did was he was the first to break the story that King Tut's tomb had been opened. Okay, so that gives you a picture or an idea of who he was. H.V. Morton did a lot of work in the Middle East, and he once wrote about this Arab coffee house in Jerusalem, which was kind of back off the streets a little bit. But what he wrote about it was that at one time it was the location of an early Christian church. Now, the Franciscans, which are a branch within Catholicism, but the Franciscan monks, they offer the tradition that church was actually built upon the site of a home that belonged to Zebedee. And the home, according to them, served as an office, kind of a branch office for his fishing industry in Galilee, and that he would sell salted fish to people in Jerusalem, including, by tradition, including to the house of the high priest. And so what that comes about to say is that John quite possibly knew all these people there, the staff, the members of the household, because he had been there before. And they allow him to come in because they know him well. Okay? And so, with all of that said, just kind of an interesting little footnote, we go back to the Apostle Peter. And Peter is brought into this courtyard by someone who is familiar to Caiaphas' household, to his staff, and it's here that he denies Jesus 3 times. In my opinion, no man has ever been treated so unfairly as the Apostle Peter. I mean, when you look at what preachers and commentators have done through the years and through the centuries, so many focus upon the failure when there are at least, I believe, 3 positive aspects to Peter even being there. And the first one is this, that Peter followed because of his courage. Peter followed because of his courage. All the other disciples except John, if John is the unnamed disciple. I mean, all the other apostles have run away. When Jesus was arrested, they scattered, with the exception of Peter and John, possibly. And if you think about what Peter has done up until this point, he displays tremendous courage. He draws his sword in the face of incredible odds. That's one of the scenes in the movie Kingdom of Heaven. In order to protect pilgrims who were inside a certain stronghold that Saladin was attacking, Balian and just a few knights go out to meet this force of 200,000 men. They're captured. Some of them are killed. They're captured. They're later released. But they do so against impossible odds. I mean, I think, last year, I think it was the young man from Kentucky, and I always go blank on his name, I ought to know it, but the young Marine who went back into the hot spot to try to rescue his team, only to find that all of his team was dead, but he did manage to rescue something like, I think 11 American soldiers and 18 Afghan soldiers. But he did that against incredible odds. He and one other sergeant went back time after time. Dakota, I just got the name. Dakota is his first name. Yes, yeah. And so that's the picture you get with Peter. He draws his sword in the face of incredible odds. He's not afraid. He is not a coward. I mean, if I titled this message, in fact, I did title the message, The Courageous Coward. Because so many people look at him as being a coward, and yet the thing that took him to the place where Jesus was his incredible courage. He followed in order to see what would happen to Jesus. He was the one brave man who was present. I mean, a key thing to remember is that his failure was a failure that could only happen to a man of tremendous courage. And I hope you get that. It could only happen because his courage took him to that place. It reminds me so much of one of my favorite quotes by Teddy Roosevelt, who says, "It is not the critic who matters, because the critic is never in the heart of the arena. It is the person who is in the pit that matters." That has helped me so much, because criticism comes with this job. Criticism comes with any position of leadership. Criticism comes with any position where you are working with people. You will be criticized. And what I want you to understand is that their criticism really doesn't matter, because they have never been and probably never will be where you are. And that's the thing that you could say about Peter. No one else dared to be where Peter was this night. Peter failed, and not because he was a coward, but because he was a brave man. And so I'll bring around again that statement that I made. Sometimes courage places us in a situation where we cannot succeed, at least by worldly standards. Secondly, Peter followed because of love. He didn't just follow because of his courage. He followed because of love. Peter loved Jesus so much that he could not let him go through this alone. Now, if you notice, Jesus is inside the house. John is in there. And Peter is on the outside. He can't speak to him. There is that scene, and I believe it, personally, I believe it to be accurate. When Peter realizes that he's denied Jesus the third time, and he hears the cock crow. If you remember in the Passion, he and Jesus lock eyes for just a moment. And that's possible. I mean, that's possible that's the whole reason that Peter is there, is just so he can get a glimpse of Jesus, just so that Jesus could see him. Maybe Peter has followed because of this deep love and this courage that he has, simply to demonstrate to Jesus, look, I'm here. I'm here. I can't tell you the number of times that Jennifer and I have been called to a person's bedside. And I got news for you folks. It's not because we have the right words. It's not because we have the answers. We are simply there. We are simply present. It's not about that at that time of having the right words or the answers for whatever anyone's going through. The whole point, what is important at the moment, is to simply be present. To simply be there. To hold a hand. Sometimes just to whisper, I'm here. We're here. See, Peter couldn't rescue Jesus. He couldn't defend him. But he could be near him. And I believe that it's that love that Peter finds himself in this situation. It's what brings him to this place. Now, the bottom line is that Peter does exactly what Jesus says that he's going to do. He denies him 3 times. He denies him. And by the way, there are a couple of difficulties with the whole cock crowing or the rooster crowing. Didn't realize this until I was, really researching this. And one difficulty is that a rooster, because of Jewish ritual laws, a rooster wouldn't be allowed inside the city of Jerusalem. It's unclean. According to their laws, during this period of time, during the Passover, it wouldn't be allowed there. A second thing is that at this time of night, it would be unusual for a rooster to crow unless you're in Haiti, okay? Or the Dominican. Yeah, I think in the Dominican one night, that rooster went crazy, didn't it? So, in some of those countries, they'll crow all night long at the moon if you let it. But at 3 a.m., which is traditionally the time that we put this at, it's kind of unheard of for a rooster to crow. Okay? So that's a couple of the difficulties. But there was a certain military practice that I found kind of interesting that I came across. The night, according to the Roman watch, the night was divided into 4 watches. It went from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., from 9 p.m. to midnight, from midnight to 3 a.m., and from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. And so one of the practices at 3 a.m., after the third watch of the night, there would be a trumpet sounded to demonstrate, or not to demonstrate, but to signal the changing of the guard at 3 o'clock. It's kind of that idea of, what's the old town crier? 2 a.m. and all's well, That kind of let you know what time it was if you were having a sleepless night. If you weren't having a sleepless night, then they woke you up anyway. But 3 a.m., this trumpet would sound, and it signaled to everyone that it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and also signaled to the guards, we're going to change guards. Now, the interesting thing about it is this. In Greek, it is called electrophonia. Electrophonia. Which means, guess what? Cock crow. It means cock crow. Now, I know there's always, I won't give away who it was, but not long ago, I was teaching around Christmas time. And I was teaching that the stable could have been a cave. And one little old lady said, she said, I don't care what he says, I still think it was a stable. A wooden stable. And that's okay. I mean, it's all right. If that's what you want to, hang on to. But what I'm saying is that it's quite possible that what Jesus said to Peter was, before the trumpet sounds the cock crow, you will deny me 3 times. Okay? Now, to me, it doesn't make any difference. Okay? It could be a rooster. I'm okay with that. I'm just kind of passing on some of the stuff that I've come across. But it is interesting to me that it could have been this trumpet sounding what was called the cock crow, which simply exchange or meant the exchange of guards, and it was a marked time at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, so Peter follows because of his great courage. Peter follows because of his love. But probably the most important element to remember in the midst of all of this, all of the sermons that you've heard about his failure, his denying Jesus, is that Peter bounces back, okay? He kind of redeems himself. I didn't want to use that language because we all know that Jesus is our Redeemer, but he redeems himself. Once Jesus restores him, I'm not saying that Peter didn't go through a very difficult time, and sometimes that's caused by other people. In this case, it's caused by the heartache that he has. And Jesus comes along on the scene, and he wins him back. He brings him back. He restores him to the rightful place. And still, it couldn't have been an easy thing for Peter to deal with. I know about a number of us who have things in our past that we still struggle with getting past, that we struggle letting go of. I deal with people year after year who will come to me, will pray about things, and they'll set down their baggage, and then in a few months they pick it all up again. And you need to know that Peter probably went through a lot of that. This couldn't have been something that was easy to deal with. There are some people who say that for quite a time afterward, Peter had to endure ridicule, including hearing people make this mock rooster call when he would pass by. I mean, imagine that. You take your sin, whatever sin it is that you're ashamed of, and people know about it. And as you know, people can be malicious. It's always, by the way, just a little side note. I know you hate side notes. I like side notes. because they allow me to express myself. But you know this, some of you know this. For years at Old Union, especially when I was coaching in the Bismarck area, there were times that we were called a cult. Did y'all know we were a cult? Well, we were called a cult. See, some of you who come from the Northland congregation, you don't know that. You joined a cult, okay? Because people are malicious. I mean, people are unforgiving about, certain things. And what it really came down to, can I tell you what it was? There was a couple of individuals, a couple of families in the Bismarck area that, because I was coaching football, what they saw was that anyone who came to our church played. All right? That's what they tried to say, which was not always true. And by the way, I'm sorry if the kids that were a part of our youth group at the time were tremendous athletes, But that's where it came from. It came from sheer jealousy. That's normally where stuff like that comes from. Most recently, and we're not even getting into some of the stories that have been made up about me, but most recently, did you know that we are a church that baptizes babies, and unless they're baptized, they're going to hell? And I'm like, no, that came out this week. Isn't it amazing? I mean, isn't it just simply amazing what people talk about? And I can't tell. I have no idea where that came from. None. I've had some baptism talks with some people here lately, but I can tell you that's never come out of my mouth, and I don't think it's come out of anyone else's mouth here. But that's and so understand that, and I don't think we do this often, to look at some of the things that we probably face and to understand that the early church faced some of that same stuff. In fact, and we've told you this before, but I'll repeat it. The whole idea of the Lord's Supper, do you know what they were often accused of? They were accused of cannibalism, because Jesus said, unless you eat of my body and drink of my blood, you can have no part of me. And so they were accused of cannibalism and all sorts of atrocious things. And so Peter is having to endure that. He's one of the first probably that has to endure that sort of ridicule. And it's all about a moment of weakness in his life. It's really not about him. See, Peter is a man of courage and sheer tenacity. I love the post-resurrection Apostle Peter, because he's the one that stands before the members of the Sanhedrin and says, you choose who you will obey. Do we listen to your voice, or do we listen to the voice of God? John and I are going to listen to the voice of God. The apostle who goes to his death on the cross, crucified upside down because he doesn't see being crucified in the same position as his Lord is something that he is worthy of. In essence, Peter and Jesus knew that the real person of the Apostle Peter would not have failed. That he wouldn't have. I mean, under most circumstances, he would not have failed. His courage and his love put him in a place, put him in a position where for a moment he broke under the pressure. For just a moment. And the wonderful blessing of Jesus is that under all of our failures, you, me, he sees the real man or the real woman. He doesn't see the failure. William Barclay says, he loves us in spite of what we do because he loves us not for the things we are, but for the things that we have it in us to be. In other words, he loves us. He loves us exactly who we are, but he also loves our potential. And we can't realize our potential as long as we hang on to the failure. So now what does that have to do with all of us? You know, when I started reading this again and looking at the text in a way, putting myself in the text, and I hope that what you have done tonight is to do the exact same thing, to place yourself there, to think about times when you've stepped out in courage and maybe it bit you. To think about the times when you've stepped out in love and maybe it just backfired. And to know that all that God requires is that we get back up again and we dust ourselves off and we follow him to the best of our abilities, knowing that there's going to be another time in a fit of courage when we may fail, or in a risk of love that we may be burnt. And then I think of this because I look at so many people who are burnt once or twice, who are struck down because of their courage a few times, and they give up. They just simply give up. And I want to leave you with this thought, because it's a question, actually. What man is a man who does not make the world better? What woman is a woman who does not make the world better? What man is a man of God who does not make the world better? What woman is a woman of God who does not make the world better? And if you quit or you give up or you decide not to risk or not to act out in courage to speak up sometimes, folks, we are not making it a better place if we refuse to be courageous and to love. I think that's the message that John gives us about Peter. And it's what Jesus saw in him, and I believe it's what he sees in each and every one of his disciples who will follow. Will we continue to act with courage, love? Will we live out our faith? It's the only way that we can turn this world upside down. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for tonight and just for the opportunity of being together and sharing your word. I pray, Father, that you would indeed begin to work within each one of us, and that we would, for maybe some who have been burnt, who are afraid to take a risk, take a chance, maybe you can restore within them that, give them that tenacity that the Apostle Peter possessed. We know, Father, that you can do all things through your Holy Spirit, through the power of Christ who is at work within us. And so, Father, I pray that you would just you would renew us. You would give us the wings of eagles that we might soar. That, Father, we could be a people who truly run and not grow tired, that we walk and not grow faint. And Father, in the words of the Apostle Paul, that we would also be a people who do not grow weary of well-doing. And so, Father, just continue with us, strengthen us. Help us, Father, to lay our baggage at the foot of the cross and to not pick it up again. And to know that through you we are indeed victorious. We just lift all this to you tonight in Jesus' name.